What is up, guys? This is All the Smoke on Strength and Physique with your hosts, Adam and Chris, where we provide you with evidence-based information, community support, and recognition to all who are betting themselves with fitness.
Welcome back to All the Smoke on Strength and Physique. We got a Picasso on the damn podcast today, man. The man has been through almost everything: personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, PhD student. He's been around in the trenches and all right now. Now he is producing textbooks, which we just learned. And I'm really excited to kind of learn a little bit more about that. But specifically right now, my man Korey, for our 8 listeners out there right now, kind of give you a preview view. Like, I first learned from you from the Clinical Athlete podcast, and I really enjoyed your perspective of, we went into the PhD, wasn't really for you because, again, I think a lot of people get into the science or they don't really understand what it maybe take. And they, again, sometimes, and I've kind of found it myself now in my PhD program, a lot of these professors, they're not very practical in a sense. And I think that's, an overwhelming problem for a lot of, scientists, right? They just, it's their niche and it doesn't pertain to certain practitioners in there. So it seems like that's one of the reasons why you said, hey, maybe this isn't for me, but we'll kind of get into that. But sure. Korey, go ahead and introduce yourself, my man.
Yeah. Well, thanks guys for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad it took a bit, but we made it work. We made it happen. So, classically, historically, I'm a strength and conditioning coach. That was my education through undergrad. Got my master's in nutrition, which is really where I got my feet wet on the academic side of things. So I was a teaching assistant from the nutrition department and would help teach, all kinds of different classes from nutrition metabolism to personal training. And then, as you mentioned, Adam, I actually started my doctorate in nutrition at Iowa State. And that was even more thrust, obviously, into the world of academia. And for me in particular, research and research that I had never been exposed to. And through different like things that happened, I ended up in a very mechanistic biochem heavy lab. And like, think about your exercise science training in undergrad. It does not prepare you for that, like, whatsoever. So even though I found the topic really interesting, because what I was researching was the effect of vitamin D on like a diabetic state, which is kind of interesting because we were getting into vitamin D, we're getting into some epigenetic stuff, but all of our research was in rats. And so I was like, I've never dealt with this before. You had to like weigh them every day and they've got diabetes, so they're like peeing on you everywhere. It's just like, what is happening? It speaks really to the importance of fit when you're doing something and how, yes, it's interesting to you. Yes, like you could muscle through it to a degree, but if it's so contrary to what really who you are and what you're prepared for, it's a big gap to fill. And, so I was a coach who's used to being on the floor interacting, and I traded, your whistle and shorts for a lab coat and rats and being in a lab, and it did not jive with me at all. So it wasn't really, the people were great, the place was great, but what I was doing was not something that suited me well. I ended up leaving that after about 1.5 years. And then, like you said, I've been in a lot of different worlds, right? So then I was a personal trainer for about six months after that. That was really my first exposure to general population and teaching them and coaching them. And it was really, really valuable. Like, would not trade that for anything. And then I got a job at a small school in Northwest Iowa called Northwestern College as a dual role professor of practice of kinesiology and strength and conditioning coach. So what that looked like was, 4 classes per semester. And I taught nutrition, motor learning, strength and conditioning, personal training, anatomy, just a very wide range of stuff. And yes, I did have to go back and relearn some of that. And then I was the strength coach for football, wrestling, the soccer teams, cheer and dance.
So you mentioned that the personal training in the
Mhm.
general population was extremely beneficial in that
Mhm.
experience. What about the experience of getting peed on by the rats and dressing in a lab coat did you find enjoyable? Because I think a lot of people, and you sort of went to it as well, and that's why I ask, a lot of people always dwell on the negatives of situation. And even if you might have not have enjoyed that, or you found out that wasn't for you, that's still something positive that I'm sure you take things away from.
Yeah, I mean, was definitely still a learning experience. I mean, there's still an aspect of me that enjoyed all of that because I'm just a nerd. You know, you kind of stop and think, man, it's kind of cool that I'm measuring gene expression in the liver of this rat that I killed earlier today or something like that. And so there's that aspect that's really cool, and you understand that you're getting and you're doing things that very, very few people get to do. But you know, like I said, that gap to jump for me at that point in time, and I mean, I don't think I would ever really look to get back into that, but it was too big for me to jump at that time. So the learning experience was definitely finding out what I was not meant to do and the type of environment I was not meant to be in. So you're absolutely right there that it's a learning experience, but yeah, I definitely enjoyed the information side of things because I love nutrition, and I was definitely getting a deep dive into it. That's for sure.
Now, walk us through that transition from, again, being a PhD student and then applying to that small, I think it was a Division III school, correct?
Yeah, NAIA D3.
Oh, okay.
It's like, yeah. Yep.
So walk us through that transition of now being involved back on the court, or it seems like, again, a variety of sports, but then also now being a teacher to other students. How was that transition? And for I guess now purposes is now that we just figured out why was the end just last year?
Yeah. The transition was a lot. It definitely was a lot because at that time, I had technically been out of strength and conditioning for 3 full years because I was around it during my master's, but I was on the sports nutrition side. My internship was sports nutrition. It was not strength and conditioning. So luckily I got 3 years on the floor during my undergrad because it was part of my education, part of my degree. And so now I go from not only the world of basically nutrition to the world of really like nitty gritty nutrition, like mechanistic type stuff. Now I'm back into, planning workouts and thinking things from a way more macro viewpoint, and just stuff my brain just hadn't thought that way in a very long time. And then, like I said earlier, I did have to relearn some of the stuff I had to teach. Like I had not taken anatomical kinesis since my sophomore year of college. And they're like, well, here's one of your class this first semester is one of them is anatomical. And I'm like, okay, get the textbook, start reading this thing. You know, luckily the classroom stuff was fairly easy to me. Like the lecture stuff was fairly easy to me. It just did take time to go through that and learn the material enough to a point where I could talk about it and answer questions. And I really just tried to think about things that I wish I would have had as a college student, or things that I knew they would need to know once they're done. If we all sat in a class at anatomical where we just learned origins and insertions and muscle actions, and then we took no step further, that became not very relevant really quickly. So I always tried to take that little step further if it was appropriate. Same when I taught sports nutrition. We spent almost no time on the nitty gritty of like the Krebs cycle or anything like that. It was more of the outcome. What does it give us? What do you need to know? If you have an athlete come up to you tomorrow in the weight room and ask you about carbohydrates. So even though it took me a few years to get things to where I wanted it to be, I just tried to sprinkle those things in as much as possible whenever I was thinking about what content we wanted to cover, what our assignment's going to look like, what our test question's going to be. But yeah, early on, it was like drinking from a fire hose.
Now, you have these different hats we'll say,
Mhm.
that you've worn? You went from sports nutrition to the really nitty gritty nutrition, then switching over to programming for the athletes, like the actual lifting itself. How did you communicate between all of the staff when you're a strength coach on the different important things that need to be focused on with this athletes? Because I know at a Division II level, even the resources are not there to give everything that the athletes need. What about at where you were at? How are you communicating with other coaches?
Yeah. It's really, if you're not Power 5 Division 1, like a lot of strength and conditioning coaches are in a very similar situation. So I would say, yeah, Chris, we were in a similar situation, in particularly my first year with regards to resources. But to answer your question about communicating, everything started off with an individual meeting with every coach that I work with. We just really tried to focus on, I tried to lead the discussion onto what they wanted to see out of their players and where they see me fitting in that development. So I tried to ask questions of like, what types of things do you want to see on the field? Like what are specific things you struggle with as a team? What types of, if it's soccer, are there certain situations that you get in where your players just cannot seem to make the moves they need to make, or they can't make the plays they need to make? Like what's going on in those situations? And then I would try to translate it, because coaches will use tons of terminology that, we don't necessarily use in exercise science. So I would have to translate it into, okay, this is the specific quality they're talking about, whether that's change of direction ability, linear speed, certain, types of power, maximum strength, and how to elicit those things. And then in later conversations, make sure that I point out where in the program we're trying to develop the thing they told me they wanted. And I think that's really key, to like make note of the language and how they described it. Even if for novice athletes, even if you take the approach of like 85% of your programming is very similar, how you describe it can be very different. And I think me really working hard to try to understand the mindset of my head sport coaches, using their same language, trying to learn about the sport as much as I could as I went, that went a long way into developing the relationship with them. And luckily, I rarely got questioned on the things I was doing.
That's good, man. Because I think, some coaches, especially, head coaches, they sometimes they're intimidated by referring out or getting somebody else's opinion, because they're intimidated of you might be taking their spot. And it's very cutthroat, especially at the collegiate level, even at the professional level. Hey, man, if you're not winning games, get the hell out of here. And then your whole staff is gone. So it's a very scary process in a sense. And you kind of see coaches tighten up or they tense up for that. But I guess specifically, what are, I guess, the main considerations that you were taking within these athletes? Because again, you barely said about 85%, they're all similar, but it was the way that you communicated your message for these athletes. Could you give us an example of, I guess, maybe football, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, like cheerleading, how or what were you saying differently to allow them to understand that, hey, this is why we're doing it, so I have a better buy-in with what we're doing?
Right. Yeah. So, with football, that's where I would rely on the situational stuff a lot. So, I'd go position group by position group. Okay, let's talk line. Like, what do we need here? Like, what are things your offensive lineman or defensive lineman, first of all, what do we need to be? And like, where's the gap from where we are now? Whether that's from a physical quality, like they can't power through or stop a defensive lineman from doing a bull rush, or it's a mobility thing. We can't get into certain positions. That will tell me like, okay, maybe, O-line needs a little more ankle mobility. Maybe they need a little more hip flexion mobility, that kind of stuff. Same. And then we'd go to running backs, linebackers, D-backs, whatever. Okay. Then try to translate what they're really going for. So like if a D-back, if I kind of find out that D-backs really struggle tracking the ball as they're running backwards kind of thing, then we maybe work on more like shoulder hip dissociation while tracking in our speed and agility work. So does that make sense to like where I'm asking like, hey, where do we struggle? Like what types of situations or movement combinations do our players maybe need to be better at? And then that goes into like your plan for later. Cheerleading and dance was definitely a learning experience for me. Like my wife was a dancer all through college, so at least I had some familiarity with that. But honestly, the biggest thing there was, first of all, they didn't want to feel like they were like an afterthought. And if you get into collegiate cheerleading, it is quite athletic. And dance is too, but I think people like still think of like high school on the sidelines and just making, arm movements and whatever. But you get into collegiate cheerleading competitive, there's all the throws and the stunts and all those things. And so actually just kind of highlighting the connection between them not only being safer when they're in exposed positions in their shoulders or just catching somebody, but then the enhanced ability to do those things by becoming stronger and more powerful. Okay. And then, so I would say cheerleading it really was strength and power. Dance was a little more GPP, work capacity. And honestly, like going back to Gen Pop, that's where I actually utilized a lot of the types of training and the communication strategies I did with Gen Pop, because a lot of those athletes had never lifted ever. And so I literally was maybe talking with people who had never squatted before or had never been through a warm up or anything like that. So that was where I would tend to focus on with those teams.
So as you were working within these different sports and you were having these meetings with coaches, how was the opportunity to individually train each of these different subset of populations? For example, football, you have linemen, you have linebackers, you have safeties, you have running backs, quarterbacks. They all probably need something a little different. But at a NAIA school, I'm sure you might have been maybe the only strength coach, maybe one more. It's not like you had 10 on staff to really target each population. So how did you approach that?
I honestly did not break it out that much. I just didn't have the bandwidth, and I didn't have the manpower for it. The best I could do really, or the best that I did, was, football was such a big team. We're talking like 90 to 120 guys, depending on if you're in season or off season. I did have a developmental program for them and like an upperclassmen program. So you had like your freshman year program and you have your sophomore, junior year programs. So sophomores and juniors were all in one program. That was the most I could break it out, because I was the most hands-on with football. And this is key, logistics allowed me to have the freshmen as the only, like they were only their own lift group. Every other team was mixed. And so in a small school setting, and again, I would almost classify all small school as non-power 5 D1. Man, it's like a zoo in the weight room sometimes, and especially in the afternoon, it's like a revolving door. One team comes in, you have the schedule set so that when they're finishing up, the next team is warming up, they come in, and it's just this cycle of teams coming in and out. And to try to do that, the same thing with soccer's and wrestling, and these teams get to be 30 to 45 people on a team when you're at this level. It just wasn't realistic or practical from a logistical standpoint. The best that I could do was, well, if there was like a very specific athlete that had an issue with the movement, I would modify as much as possible. So if we had an athlete that like back squat was just a no-go, it did not agree with them, they had a terrible history with it, they knew to come to me any day we back squatted, and I would alter it for them, or I'd alter it beforehand. But they knew that would be just between me and that athlete. Okay. always adapting. I adapted probably something every day based on an injury or restriction. From a programming standpoint, I really tried to rely, once it was appropriate, on autoregulatory methods to try matching the amount of volume an athlete would need to progress from a strength standpoint. And yeah, that kind of became what almost every team I would utilize some type of auto regulation to make sure they were getting the stimulus needed, or not getting as much volume as they should, or if they didn't need as much volume, they wouldn't get it. If they needed more, they would get it through these methods. So that was the best way I could come up with to individualize. Yeah.
Now, because you open that can, and that's
Let's
my bread and butter is auto regulation, my friend. What were you doing, or how were you auto regulating your program? So like, specifically what I think of in a lot of college sports, they claim to have a linear periodization or some sort of periodization. I think FNLP has a lot of great utility because, again, you have so many fucking athletes. It's really impossible to be like one by one, how are you feeling? Are you specifically maybe, hey, if you feel this way, do this workout, or if you feel in this way, do this workout? Or what sense of auto regulation were you doing?
I relied on APRE. I relied on autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise. Like I had to try to find means to do it in a non-subjective way. We didn't have, again, the manpower. If we had like in season football, we the entire team trained 65 guys at once, and you could probably know that half of them show up 5 minutes before. So to do some kind of like pre-training questionnaire was not realistic. I had interns try to do a Google Sheets, pre-training questionnaire. They ended up finding that people just did 3, 3, 3. If it was a scale 1 to 5, they would just kind of, and that there's a lot of factors there. So I would rely on basically rep max or rep dictated methods to adjust the intensity and the volume.
Now, could you walk us through, I guess, a specific situation of how you would adjust it right on the fly? Because again, it blows my mind. You're able to still do that with 80 kids or 80 athletes in one single room. Or again, I'm sure that was on you of the education aspect. And I guess one of my other questions is, did you always kind of maybe rely on 1 or 2 or however number it is on a specific player or players to be like, hey, I'm gonna teach you this. If you catch one of these guys doing it or incorrectly or correctly, let them know or let me know. Did you ever have any sort of relationship like that as well?
Not necessarily, because luckily we had a strength and conditioning major. So once it got up and running, we had about 10 students in that program. And, just through sheer having great students, and I mean, I feel like we prepared them well. We rely on them for running our sessions. And so in this case, I tried to have at least 1 lift per session. The last set was signed off by a coach, or the most important set, as we'll get into with the APRE, was always signed off by a coach. So if an athlete saw a bolded set on their sheet, they knew to find me or one of my interns, and they would have to watch that set and get it circled. So that's kind of how I took care of that. That's not always feasible for everybody. So here's how I would do, the APRE. And I wouldn't do it with every athlete because it's just a lot to manage. So basically the APRE is, you'll have 2 warm-up sets. Let's say it's back squat. Okay. You have 2 warm-up sets. So maybe like a set of 10 and a set of 8. And then you have a third set that's your test set. And that would be dictated by percent of 1 rep max. So we might have a set of, or we might have 80% on the bar. Reps are not determined because they're going to go for basically a rep max. I never did true rep maxes. I always said leave 1 or 2 in the tank. So we would go to like an RPE like 9, which I educated them on. Based on their number of reps, their third or their fourth and their fifth sets would be adjusted. So let's say again, 80% on the bar. Most people can get around eight-ish reps with that. Let's say I set the range at like, if they got 5 to 7 reps, their weight went down by 5%. If they got like 8 to 10 reps, their weight stayed the same. And then if they got 11 or more, their weight went up by 5%, again, for their fifth set and their sixth set, or their fourth and the fifth, I'm sorry. All that was already on their workout card. Okay, so we watched that third test set. If an athlete gets how many reps they get, we tell them, hey, make sure you understand these are your next 2 sets, and they would be on their way with their last 2 sets. So athletes who were feeling not good, or they needed more time to quote unquote grow into their weights, they just hadn't developed the skill of lifting that weight yet, they would go a couple weeks with only getting the low end range, and they would have to take a little bit of weight off the bar for their last 2 sets. A lot of people would stay the same, but then, a few weeks in, you start getting 11. Like a lot of people start doing it, and then that adjusts the next week, right? And that's how I would run it a lot. And so a lot of the methods that I would employ would be based off of that. And if anyone wants to look into that more, Brian Mann has a book on the APRE, so check that out. And that would be like the true, like pure APRE, whereas mine was a little bit modified.
So you take this approach with 2 warm-up sets. I'm just going to recap, make sure I have it on the same track. 2 warm-up sets, 1 testing set, which would be approximately 80%. Does that ever change depending on what you're shooting for? Yep. So you do that based on what range they hit. You either adjust it down 5%, increase it up 5%. The numbers of going down or up was already on their sheet. And then they would complete those 2. And then how do you know what to do the following workout or the following week?
Because if they went above, if they had a weight bump, then I adjusted their 1 rep max.
Okay. All right. So that makes sense. Now, was this something you utilized for almost all your sports teams, or just football? Or when would this be a good time to use it and not use it?
I actually ended up using some version of it with all my teams. Yep. And I would use this would be early off season. So this would be, I mainly had the fall sports. This would be your January, February, March block. And just because that was when we were just going for strength gains the most by far. And then I did use it a lot in the summer programs as well. And that the summer programs wouldn't always be the APRE. It'd be something like, here's your weight, get as many reps as you can. Again, up to like 9. And I did educate them on what an RPE meant, or we also use reps in reserve. Okay. And then I might say for 3 sets after that, you're decreasing your reps by 2. So if they warm up and they get 5 reps on their test set, they would have 3 sets of 3 after that. So that'd be another way we could do it.
Now talk about just the environment and the culture that you probably developed through those almost plus sets that you were developing. Like, that's got to be some sort of like hype mentality, because there's a good research out there with VBT. It increases competitiveness, it increases culture within, rugby teams and stuff like that. So did you experience anything like that where people would just like circle around and be like, let's go, and anything like that?
Yeah, you got there. It took a bit, but it definitely got there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure that had like some great carryover to developing relationships, especially on and off that field, because a weight room, like, it really develops that culture. And I think a lot of maybe coaches or just outside general public, they miss that part of it. And if you're able to develop some great bonds within the weight room and produce hopefully injury prevention while we're doing that, man, like that's a lot of fun. And again, you're teaching it the correct way of how to auto-regulate. And I think, again, that's a missing piece, because a lot of people, they think every time I go in the gym, I should be able to add 5 pounds to that bar, or I should be able to do, 2 extra reps and not break eventually. But the way you probably taught it is going to stick with those athletes for quite a long time, and hopefully improve their training history.
Yeah, I really try to take as much of a flexible approach as possible because our readiness is not the same day in and day out, week to week. So I tried to account for that. And, I think anyone who gets into training people, they kind of understand that to a degree. And so with these traditional periodization models, you can see where the faults are. Not that they can't work, because I didn't do any auto regulation training as an athlete, and I still made progress. So they could definitely work. And it's not to say that they don't, but I think that for the long term, not just looking at a 8-week off season, I think that's probably a better approach, especially if you have a lot of athletes and you can't individualize maybe the way you would be able to with the smaller group.
Yeah. And I think auto regulation, it's still in its infancy. I believe the way you're mentioning is how I've read it. I think it was in triphasic training that they talked about increasing, decreasing it based off your third set, the test set. But that's how we would monitor the program itself. I think earlier you said about 80% of your program for all your athletes was practically the same. Maybe that number was slightly off, but that's just a general number. Like a majority of the programs are usually the same. But I think what people don't realize is really sport specific training is going to account for that remaining percentage. What does sport specific training mean to you? And how does that sort of differ between different type of sports or athletes within a certain sport?
Yeah. So just to clarify, that 80% earlier was just an example.
Yeah, that's what I figured too.
Okay.
Like it could have been 75%, like a large.
I don't even know. Like, I don't even know. Like personally, I don't even know.
It's an arbitrary number.
Yeah, that's a common one. But because I tried to, honestly, I don't know if I ever attained this, but I tried to get to a point, even within the construct with where I was working. I tried to make it to a point where if you looked at my program, you could be like, well, that's not a football program. Or like, I bet that's soccer. Or, you know what I mean? I tried to like make sure that they should look different sport to sport. Now, there's only so many ways you can train the body under load. So of course there is some crossover between movements and whatnot. And I did have the field sports, so there's going to be some crossover there too. I mean, when it came to sports specificity, I tried to look at what is the force producing requirements of the sport. So football, depending on the position, you have a high requirement to produce force, right? Especially as you get closer to the ball. As you get away from the ball, not as much. And again, that's where I tried to rely on some auto regulation to account for the fact that a wide receiver and a defensive back do not need to be as strong as a linebacker and a defensive lineman. Okay. I couldn't get as individualized as like a Matt Rhea, who as soon as they get to like 1.7 times body weight on their squat, they're not doing strength anymore. But it just didn't become quite an emphasis if I had a receiver who was like double body weight squat. Now, with regards to a sport like soccer, they need to be strong enough in order to be able to change direction and run fast. All right. But they don't necessarily, although I don't know, soccer doesn't get sometimes the credit deserves for being a contact sport, at least the soccer at the NAIA level, maybe. But they don't generally have to move another human like a football player does. So once I looked at our strength numbers across the board in soccer, I just didn't focus on strength all that much, like maximum strength. Or I would do it through like single leg training. That's a little less quantifiable. Like we didn't do like split squat maxes, or we didn't have a single leg RDL max. And that's where I would try to rely on RPE. Okay. So I look at that first, and then really where I tried to differentiate my programs was direction of force application. Okay. And again, this is where maybe some of my field sports looked similar, because especially, in football and soccer, the running, the cutting, the jumping, you're doing all those things in those sports, again, depending on position, especially in football. All right. But even in football, my lineman programs would have a lot more frontal plane movement in it than some of the other positions. Again, depending on if I could get enough manpower in there. So especially once we got out of that early off season, I really tried to pay attention to, well, actually, I'll use an example of early off season first. And what I mean by like direction of force. So at force application. So one thing that I really started to get into was heavy sled sprinting for acceleration development. And, as you know, and as listeners may know, horizontal force generation is key in acceleration ability. Like we know it's both horizontal and vertical, you're producing force, but really what will drive you being a good accelerator is your ability to produce force horizontally into the ground. And I was reading some of JB Marin's stuff. I was talking with a guy like Ken Clark about what they're experiencing with heavy sled. And it allows you to produce force in that vector and direction better than anything else. Right? It's essentially specific strength training for acceleration. Like you can try to do it with a split squat. You can try to do it with like a very, forward shin angle split squat, but that's not ballistic like a sprint. Right? So I saw it as heavy single leg ballistic training when we did that stuff. As we got like closer to the season, then we'd maybe focus a little bit more on top speed. But knowing that I wanted to increase the acceleration ability of my players and what direction they needed to apply force, that led me down the path of heavy sleds. Now, then I would also try to sprinkle in frontal plane and transverse plane as much as I could as well. That was appropriate. So even from the beginning of development with regards to like power training, jump training, and plyometrics, we would do everything three-dimensionally. So almost from the get-go, we were doing something laterally or rotationally. So even if it's just like a depth drop. So we might have a set or a week where it's just classic step off the box or step off the platform and land and stick. Next week, it's as you step off the box, rotate 90 degrees. And so you're landing 90 degrees and you do that each way. Next week, it might be step off the box laterally. So now you're having to decelerate and develop eccentric force in the frontal plane. And then that would bleed into everything that we did. So all the plyos we did, all the jumps we did would feed into making sure we were getting all planes of motion. And I know coaches know that, like that's like something that's said a lot, like train in all planes of motion, but sometimes I don't think that's present in programs. And then with the strength work too, we would try to do, I think my soccer players and my football players got sick of lateral squats, but I'm thinking that if we need to be better in agility and cutting, I don't know if I know a better movement. So go ahead. I think one of you was going to ask a question.
No, I just wanted to highlight, like, from all of these, I guess, exercise selections that you are putting out there, nothing is super complex, even at this collegiate level. Like, you kept it simple. A sled, if you wanted to add a little bit more variety to a jump, you just said literally turn, but you didn't make them put a band around their ankle, or you didn't make anything super complex, what a lot of people think it has to be to get to this optimal level. You kept it to the basics, like literally training all three planes of motion, but you added your own little variety to it with, again, a simple depth drop. And as you said that, I was like, damn, I didn't even think of that. Like, I'm doing something else. But again, it's that simple. And that's all it really needs to be to keep them more safe in the weight room. Because I think, again, that's probably a rule that you had for yourself is, hey, I want you to walk out of this weight room the way you walked in, which is healthy, right? And to jeopardize it and make it more complex or special in whatever way, it really increases that risk. So I just wanted to highlight that specifically because
to piggyback off of both of you there, it's something that I recently heard. I forget where, maybe it was on our podcast, Adam, but as we develop as coaches, people ask, like, as you get to be a better coach, does your exercise knowledge and your exercise pool, does that expand? And I don't know if the person explained it this way or we just started talking about it, but it's actually the exact opposite. Like the pool actually gets smaller. Like, for example, you mentioned lateral lunges for doing, or lateral squats to develop lateral acceleration, and lateral strength.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of the sport, if the individual moves side to side, lateral lunge is going to be a great thing. Like, it doesn't matter if it's soccer, it doesn't matter if it's football. You're not going to put a different exercise for both of those because lateral lunge is going to be very good for that.
Yeah.
So that's go ahead.
And that's what I was saying earlier about there's going to be crossover with the movements, and especially if like you're dealing with a field sport, there's going to be, they need a lot of the same stuff. As from that standpoint. Now, to take it a little further, if I knew that a certain position had higher ratios of something, like I said, offensive lineman's going to be kind of working in that frontal plane more than other positions. So there were definitely times where I would actually alter their plyos and some of their accessory movements to reflect that. So like one off season, I always tried to have at least one day was their like lower body kind of quad dominant accessory was either frontal or transverse plane. All the like skill positions had a sled crossover run. And again, I saw that as a strength movement because we loaded it, and the offensive lineman had shuffle instead. It just had that. So just on their card, it just said semi-skill, crossover run, line, shuffle. And so like I just would try to do that a little as much as I could if I knew that a certain group or position or athlete had different demands. Now, Chris, that's an interesting point about the exercises, because I almost feel like I went the other way, because really early on at my time in Northwestern, we had a very small weight room. We could not do the Olympic lifts. We had 5 squat racks, 6 benches, and like 3 homemade platforms, no bumper plates, bars that were like bent. And I just am like, wow, I have to expand my toolbox here, because I was raised in the field, quote unquote, very traditionally, Olympic lifts, and that's how you do it for your power development. And I couldn't do any of that. So I had to delve into the world of like jumps and throws and post-activation potentiation methods. And then once I got later into my time there, and I'm trying to think of how are there ways I can challenge and load different vectors of force production. So, because I would even try to get in like 45-degree type stuff, because everything isn't in a clean like a cardinal plane. So I would try to think of like medicine ball type variations, things where they might go like from a depth drop right into a medicine ball throw against a wall in the frontal plane. So it'd be like a lateral throw, or they might do like a step back or like a little jump back with the medicine ball and then throw at the wall and they're facing to the side. You know, those are ways you can add a little bit of load and challenge to it. And so I felt like I had to almost expand my toolbox a little bit. But I also did rely on a lot of potentiation methods. So there's some of that too.
So let me ask you then, what do you prefer? Did you, now, like the Olympic lifts, or did you prefer kind of the way you had to teach it within your strength and conditioning program? Because I've always, and this is my bias, Olympic lifts, golly, they take a long ass time to learn. And I'm just impatient as hell. And I can only assume, right, you have a small window within the season. So now you have to spend time of teaching that. I guess maybe you can dedicate that to the off season and stuff like that. But from now knowing both, what would you choose?
Both. Okay. So I made that decision, number one, based on the sport. What, and I'm not going to be like Tim Sukumel. I don't know the research like he does as far as like what's going to end up being, the pull versus the catch variation versus the jump variation and like force production and all that stuff. But, football is a violent sport. Olympic lift is a violent lift. And I know that there may not be some like scientific data to support this, but catching a clean on your shoulders and landing from a trap bar jump are different animals. And so I just felt like that would prepare my guys a little bit better. And then I'd also go based on kind of development of the team. Like, what is their physical development? What do I know about them from a movement standpoint? Are they mature enough to pay attention to all the intricacies that might go into an Olympic lift? And I never went from the floor. I did everything from the hang. So that kind of helped with the teaching as well. And like I said, football, I got more hands-on with. Like I had the freshmen as their own group. So I felt way more comfortable implementing the lifts. And what I started doing was every day had a barbell complex in it. Every day. As soon as we got into the weight room after the general warm-up, if there was an Olympic lift on the day, they had a barbell complex. And that accelerated the time, learning time very quickly. So that's how I kind of got around that. But having to develop my toolbox from a jump standpoint and using those things I never really had to use before was very beneficial.
Yeah, man. And I got to give you a lot of credit, man, for thinking hella critically with what you had at your disposal. And I'm sure that you would agree with what you had. It provided you a lot more growth and development and education throughout that process.
No
but
doubt.
Walk us through a little bit what you're doing now, man. Because I was still under the pressure. My man's still a strength coach. Like, we're gonna get into that, but you threw me for a right field when you're like, nah, man, I work for a book publishing company. So go ahead and tell us what made you make that transition.
Yeah. So right now, just to give the listeners kind of what you're referring to is I am what's called an acquisitions editor for Human Kinetics. So any exercise science student will know that because a lot of your textbooks are from Human Kinetics. But Human Kinetics also has a non-academic branch that is, books you would find in Barnes and Noble when you go to the workout or the sports section. And that's my division. It's the trade and professional division. And if you're thinking to yourself, what the heck does an acquisitions editor do? I have that same thought. When I saw the job description, I'm like, I don't know what that is, but I'm going to find out. So the crux of my job is to develop and conceptualize new book ideas and then find and recruit authors to write those books. Okay. And then once an author agrees to write a book, my job is to help them throughout the entire writing process, whether that's brainstorming ideas, whether that's helping them with formatting their manuscript. I edit the manuscript, so my editorial role is content. So I was hired because of my content knowledge, not because I'm a writer. And even though I've always kind of enjoyed writing, and in fact, in transitional times in my career so far, one of them being when I did leave the collegiate side, I thought to myself, I wonder what it would be like to be an editor. I never thought it'd be acquisitions. I thought it'd be more like, editing for Men's Health or editing for a magazine like that. It kind of uniquely incorporates everything that I've done to this point. Because I have specific subject areas, and they are strength and conditioning, strength training, and nutrition. So any topic, any book on those topics that falls under those umbrellas, I am responsible for. I'm responsible for growing what's in the Human Kinetics library based on that, as well as updating any additions we feel need updated. So that's what I'm doing now, and it's awesome. I never thought I would be doing this, but I always knew that I wanted to do something that allowed me to connect with professionals constantly. And that's exactly what I have to do for my job, because you need to know who's who and who's doing what and who's a content expert and who is going to be well suited to communicate their expertise to the target population.
So what are some important factors that you'll take into account beside, well, I'm not even to make an assumption. What are some factors you'll take into account?
For what, like what book to do, or
like when you said you're trying to figure out who someone is, or you build these relationships with other individuals, how do you go about seeking those individuals and what do you look for?
I mean, a lot of it is based off of who's doing speaking at conferences, who's publishing the papers on a specific content area, who is putting out content, whether that's on websites or blogs or social media. And that's kind of where you start. Or, you could ask someone who might know. So like very early on, I had to do a lot of reach outs to get a sense for what people thought is important and what's needed as far as an information perspective. So I got a lot of, so actually one of my areas is soccer. Within strength and conditioning, I have a specific emphasis in soccer. So I started reaching out to soccer coaches that I knew. In my first few weeks, I probably talked to half a dozen MLS coaches about, hey, what problems are you facing? What do you think needs to be out there? What do you wish you would have had when you were an up and coming strength coach? And that kind of starts my process of conceptualizing books. And I did the same with nutrition. I'm always looking for those things. And so for like looking at an author, are they a content expert? Do they have at least some format that they've used to communicate their content expertise, whether that's writing or speaking, because not everyone has writing experience in our field for sure. And then do they have a platform to promote that knowledge? So it's not that social media is everything, but it's absolutely a factor, because ultimately my job is to create things that will sell. And that, not unfortunately, it is a factor. Like it is, exposure matters. Like, you guys need exposure for your podcast, or else, you want to get up to 10 listeners at least,
And that's really great, because before this, I was pretty sure that we were at 4 listeners, but I think you added on 4 more, because that was the first time Adam ever said 8. So,
there we go. Yes,
this is impressive.
It's that Korey effect, man. It's like the Brady effect, but with podcasts.
But no, this has been absolutely amazing, and your different perspectives on not only a student, a researcher, a strength coach, and now also an editor. Go ahead, let our listeners know where they can find you: Instagram, Human Kinetics website, or anywhere that you might be.
Yeah, I'm on all social media channels. Just search my name, Korey Van Wyk, VANWYK. You'll find me. I don't know if you guys, my email, koreyvw@hkusa.com. If anyone knows of someone who would be a good author, if you have a book idea that you're throwing around in your head, I'm always open. So that's another part of my job. I evaluate those things. If you know of someone, DM me on social, shoot me an email. I love to hear what you think. Yeah, guys, I love the conversation. Great questions. And I'm really glad we can make this happen.
Yeah, man, this was a great and different perspective for this podcast. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because again, my apologies. I was
good.
Oh, word, man. So again, man, keep doing that great work. And I'm glad to hear that it's in the right hands of someone like you that will reach out and do again, you made it sound like you're doing your homework and to put out valuable content out there in books or ebooks, whatever it may be, because as you know, and we all know, there's a lot of garbage out there. But again, we got somebody that's been in the trenches that's going to do the work to make sure we get quality and good content out there. So, man, that's exciting to hear. So Korey, it was a pleasure to have you on. We'll make sure to put all that information that you just provided in the show notes. And
Yes.
that was all the smoke with my man, Korey Wyk. If you have any question for him, don't be afraid to DM him. If you have a book idea, write the damn book and get into his DM.
Yes.
All right, my man. Appreciate y'all.
All right.
Make sure you guys give us a review, hit him up, and we will see you guys on the next episode.